I should do that. It's recording. We're all good. Cool. Right. So, hi everybody, and welcome to my talk about how Apple ultimately ended up killing my app through their shenanigans. So, a little about me. So, I work at Genio as a senior software engineer. This talk isn't about Genio, though. This is about a side hustle that I've had for the last 5 years, where I try and basically build my own product. So the latest attempt of my kind of side hustle was building an app called Garner. And Garner is a self-reflective app, journal app for iOS. I built it, I launched it, and then I eventually binned it off because Apple was messing me about. This could be seen as a bad workman blaming his tools, but you know, what was I actually trying to do with those tools, and did they help is more of the question of this talk. So in order to prove that I am actually a good workman and my tools were the ones that are crap, here's some experience I've had building mobile apps. So the first time that I ever built a mobile app was back in 2012, where I had to use MapKit and build my own tiles to fix the empty blob that Apple Maps had put where the hospital that I worked for was supposed to be. And the local newspaper ended up actually asking for a picture of said app. So if anybody fancies my hand modeling career kicking off, please get in touch. But this talks mostly around two apps that I've done, the last two I've done, which is Jiffy CV, which I did with Aiden. Come on, you know you want to put your hand up. Yeah, there you go. And Garner, which I kind of also did a little bit with Aiden, but then ended up basically just doing it because, yeah, exactly. Who does that? So this talk can be split into 3 stages, but I'll go into a little bit of detail about what those stages are. So what Garner is and what it does, how I got the idea for it and why I chose to use iOS, and then how I carved my MVP out, and then I built it and I used it to start getting feedback. Then deciding on what was going to make it into 1.1 and how I then struggled to get 1.1 to work and the impact that that had on me as I was struggling. And then basically why I decided to kill my app and what I came to realize after I killed it. But first, I'm going to do my elevator pitch for Garner. I should just stop moving, really, shouldn't I? Yeah, so put your hand up if you keep a log of some form of the projects that you have worked on during your working experience. Couple of hands. What about skills that you've learned or applied? What about business value that you've delivered? Now put your hand up if you wish you had done that. There you go, see, that's the best bit, right? So I also have that issue, right, where I do loads of stuff and then I forget to actually document it. So I'd started building Garner. So the idea behind it was that you have a set of questions that you ask yourself, and that basically allows you to reflect on what you've been doing at work. So you can see here, there's like some stuff from the office about how you know, if you were Michael, how you were making things more fun. You know, how did you calm Dwight down after Jim did something horrible? And then, you know, as you reflect at the cadence that works for you, you start to identify new areas that you might want to reflect on. And then you can go and update those questions over time. So maybe, you know, a merger has happened and then you want to talk about how the new people emerge, you know, fitting into the office and stuff like that, which I think was like season 2 of that show. But eventually over time, you know, you build up your log of projects, your skills, your business value, and that kind of also helps you understand your needs because you've kind of thought about what you're doing and what direction you want your work to go into. And then with Garner, you can export your data into a markdown file, and then that basically can be used to be reformatted into things like performance reviews, CV updates, and God forbid, you might even put something on LinkedIn. So that's the app itself, but let's look how I got into the mess in the first place. So my first product. So I spent some time volunteering for a Pokemon Go community who were building some apps called Sylph Road. They wanted me to build this PvP app, matching app thing in React Native. I kind of did that for them, and then they didn't launch it. So I got really pissed off, and I thought, screw it, I'm going to build my own app. So I had this idea kicking around since 2016 when I found myself without a job for the first time and I was desperately looking for work. The startup I had worked for then had gone under and I found myself in a bit of a crap situation. So I hadn't been thinking about finding a new job, right? I was not prepared for that. I hadn't been keeping tabs on what I'd done for the last 3 years. And because it was a startup, I had worked initially as a junior front-end developer and then went all the way to software development manager. So there was a lot of stuff I had done. And then given the hats that I had worn, I had loads of different types of roles I was trying to apply for. So each of those needed a bespoke CV. Being a developer, I looked at that problem and I kind of created a system to make that easier. The way it worked was that the user would have a job. That job would have multiple representations of what they did. Say you might have a developer one, you might have a manager one. And then to build a CV, you would select that representation of that job that you would want to use. And that's that system made building those bespoke CVs really fast. The GIF here shows basically somebody, well, not now because it's looped, so we'll wait a little bit. But essentially what it will show is that somebody has exported their LinkedIn data. Come on, it's not that long. It's like 20 seconds. Yeah. Just, come on, yeah, that's all. There we go, right. So they're importing their LinkedIn data here. And then because that's got all of their, like what they've worked on and stuff like that, when they go to create a CV, it's literally just select what you want, remove some stuff, and then it does the job really quickly. I think it was like going from LinkedIn import to CV in about 30 seconds, hence the reason it's Jiffy, right? So I was really excited about building this app, and the thought of launching my own idea into the world and impacting other people's lives was the thing that kind of gave me the energy to build this, because we built this during lockdown, so it was fun times. But unfortunately, when I built that, I had my head up my arse, because I totally forgotten to do the product development side of everything. I was so interested in the tech side that I completely forgot to focus about anything else. And as a result, the app didn't make much money. I mean, it made, what, like, I sold 13 units at like £3 a pop or something like that. And we started to get feedback from people, and I completely had missed the mark with the app. And it was going to take a lot of work to change the direction to get where people wanted it. But I was already burned out. I had spent 7 months building this thing. So I ended up taking the app down from the stores, and I couldn't, because I just got sick of living in fear of Sentry reporting an issue and then me having to like go and pull my hair out to fix it. So after I'd done all that, I spent 3 years distracting myself with other ideas and learning a bit more about product development. But you can only distract yourself for so long, right? Eventually, you kind of have to look at what you did and try again. So when looking back at Jiffy CV, I realized that I had some good ideas, but I went the wrong way around them. I mixed up usability testing with idea validation and assumed that having my friends and family run through my mockups was be enough to make sure that the idea worked or not. And also I was like leading questions when talking about the app, trying to get people to agree that it was a good idea as opposed to actually learning what people wanted. So it was no wonder that it didn't work well. But reviewing my notes at the time, I saw a pain point that kept popping up. And that was that how would a user who used the app continue to keep using the app once the CV they made got them a job? So my notes had a load of ideas around creating a journal that allowed the user to document what they did at work and then have NLP, which was like the style at the time, to categorize those for CVs later. So I decided to spend a little time working on that idea and realized a few things. So CV generating apps are completely pointless because AI does that for you now. So that problem that I was solving with Jiffy CV is completely redundant. But AI needs data. So collecting that data for the CV over time would be a good area to start trying to understand. And I still had that problem that I had in 2016 where I didn't update my CV that often. I didn't log what I was doing. So I still needed to build that kind of app. So that pivot in mind, with that pivot in mind, I started looking at user research platforms and how I could try and get real people's thoughts on journaling and using journals or journal entries to create CVs. So I found Ballpark a good tool for this. It allows you to create surveys and conduct user research and has like really good respondent recruitment tools. I was able to get a free trial for 5 survey respondents, and I had asked them some initial open-ended questions to try and generate some ideas around that area. And then I followed that up with paying about £75 to ask 20 people more pointed, closed questions around journaling and CVs to get some quantitative data from that. So that survey basically yielded that 75% of respondents indicated that they thought it was a good idea to keep a log, which was kind of similar to people putting their hands up earlier. 55% of the respondents already did keep some form of log, which I think, again, is quite similar to this group. And 60% wanted to use that log as a career coach or some way of like, understanding where they wanted to go with their career. So that was enough of an indication to basically say that I was going to solve my problem, but other people kind of shared that problem as well. But user research data, unfortunately, doesn't really mean anything in the grand scheme of things. So you're only really going to know if your idea has legs if you build something and shove it in people's hands and ask them to use it. And for that, I needed an MVP. So the user research was useful when building that MVP because I was able to rank different pain points from it and focus on hitting the ones that basically everybody had at the top. So I started by building a basic map of the different things that people had raised, creating a rudimentary user journey map, and then grouping the tasks into 3 different activities. So journaling, which is the reflect bit, goal creation and tracking, which is the grow bit, and then basically using the data that was collected to generate that CV, performance review work, etc. And that's that thrive bit. The job of the app MVP was then to expose the finished slice of the functionality that would demonstrate the value of that system. So I mapped out the functionality I wanted to build into a user story map, which is this thing, and basically pulled together a basic feature set that would kind of show the user how they could update these questions, they could answer over time. So they could add and remove them as they needed to as the needs of reflection changed for them. They could do a reflection, which is the main thing, right? They could be reminded to reflect, and they could also then export the data into a human readable format that they could use with like other tooling such as ChatGPT or whatever. And that would then allow me to explore if people wanted to update the questions that they were asked, and how often they would do that. If people found value in being reminded to reflect, or if they just did it ad hoc, and what tooling that those people were piping that exported data into. So after deciding on the feature set that I was going to build, I thought then about how I would enable myself to build that MVP quickly and ensure that I had a sustainable development of the app and maybe even more apps. So I had used React Native to create Jiffy CV. So sorry about this, Brett. This is gonna hurt, but React Native is meh. But I had used that for Jiffy CV, and I wasn't a big fan. We'd only ever made money on iOS as well, and it kind of made me think, I want to build an iOS app or I want to build a web app. But a web app, while it gives you fast deployment time, if I wanted to share data between different web apps, I'd have to have a server, and that meant managing user data, and that was a thing that was a bit too risky for me. Also, AI would require to connect to a third-party service. So that's either me having to figure out how much money per request is going to cost to do that, or asking some user to put their credentials in and stuff like that. But iOS, it gave me access to iCloud. And iCloud would take care of the account thing. It would take care of using the storing the user data for me. And also it has this thing called app groups, which is this illustration here, where you can kind of have a database in one app and then kind of allow other apps to access it. Also at the time, Apple was gearing up to launch the Apple Intelligence stuff that it was working on. And also they were saying that iOS update would bring access to these foundation models, which is now live actually in the new one. So you could basically use kind of ChatGPT, but within their kind of thing. So iOS felt like a no-brainer for me. So while I've done iOS development in the past, things have moved on since building an app involved IB actions and Objective-C. I hope anyway, you probably tell me a bit more about that. So I decided to explore the recommended way of doing things by rebuilding Jiffy CV in Swift Data and Swift UI and a library called PDF Blocks, which showed me the power of result builders. I was really impressed with how easy it was to get a basic clone of Jiffy CV going in Swift, as well as being impressed by Swift in general, because it's quite a nice language, to be honest. After doing my initial tech investigation, I set out building my actual MVP. So I took a iOS design kit from Figma and pulled together a Swift UI looking prototype, which had 3 screens. So these would be the settings screen, where people would set the questions to answer in their reflection, and also to set the reminder to reflect. The reflection list, where a user would be able to see all their reflections, add a reflection, edit a reflection, and then the actual form they would fill out when doing a reflection. I used Swift Data and Swift UI to implement those screens because I was hoping that those would future-proof my app, and also the query hooks would like make the development more streamlined. And within a couple of hours, I had my MVP done, and I was ready to start showing people. But first, I thought I'll play around with it myself, see how it's going. And that's when the fun stopped. The app had issues. Namely, adding questions didn't mean that the reflection entry screen would actually show that question. Questions could be ordered, but you couldn't actually depend on that ordering when viewing them. And the app crashed when you tried to put any text in the inputs. So as you can imagine, building a journaling app that crashes when you try and write a journal makes you feel like... Luckily, I'm used to feeling like... So I didn't wallow in misery, and I got really pissed off, and I tried to make it work again. The biggest issue with taming this MVP was that the reactiveness of the query hooks meant that I hadn't really documented any of the state transitions. So I didn't really know how my app worked. And that made it really hard to debug because I couldn't even start to try and reproduce the issues I was seeing. But I'm a big believer in static testing as a means to understand problems. So I decided to bring in my favorite tool for defining test cases, which is X-Ray. X-Ray basically allows you to create a set of manual tests, but you can also do automation as well. So I used X-Ray to create some basic manual tests, starting with the core flow of adding a question and then using, well, basically answering that question in a reflection. Writing out the actions and the expected results for that flow then allowed me to think about the edge cases and how the app would react to them. And before I knew it, I had 18 test cases that documented the behavior of my app. I then executed those tests, documenting where the app deviated from the expected behavior and created some bugs. And it was easy to create those bugs because I'd basically done the actions to, or the steps to reproduce by, carrying out those actions. So after executing all those tests, I had my bugs that I could start fixing. And to fix those, I needed to start unit testing. So as I was new to Swift, I was most definitely new to writing tests in it. So I read up on Apple's documentation for testing Swift data. And it turns out Apple forgot to think about that, which is awesome. So I had to find other resources. Ironically, the resource I found to help me unhack my MVP was Hacking with Swift. Paul showed how to wrap the model context in a way that I could set up the data, perform an action, and verify that the correct changes had been made. And if that sounds familiar to anybody who's done any iOS development for a while, it's basically the MVVM pattern, the same pattern that Apple says Swift data makes redundant. So I refactored my app to use MVVM. I added tests as I did, added additional tests for my bugs. And this allowed me to fix the issues I was seeing where the views weren't refreshing and the ordering of list items were shifting about between the views. And finally, my app was a lot more stable. I had a nice pattern that made organizing and testing my code easy. And I was feeling confident again. However, that confidence only came because I ignored Apple's recommendations around Swift data. So what went wrong when I first used my app? One of the features of the app was this updatable set of questions that the user answers in reflections, right? I had modeled that in a way that when you change that set of questions, it's stored in like an intermediate model called, well, I call it the reflection configuration. And this makes sense because if you reflect on a big project's progress, and then that project wraps up, and then you delete the questions related to that project, you wouldn't want those existing reflections to suddenly not have those questions as answers anymore, right? You want them to stick around. So when I was using the app, I found that the UI was always one reflection configuration out of date, most likely because of Swift data's saving magic not working as expected. The reflection configuration was also the root cause of the other two issues. When I used when you have a relational field in Swift data, you interact with it like it's an array. So you insert, remove items, and when you create a new instance, you are creating it with an array. But you can't actually depend on the order of those elements in that relational field. And that's what caused the ordering issues and also the crash. So crash was also kind of caused by the way that Apple teach you about the list detail view pattern. They teach you to basically create an instance of the list item and then navigate to the detail view of it to edit it. And then you press back and that's supposed to save the changes. But with Swift data, those changes are actually saved as you type. And when you don't have reliable ordering, it's causing a re-render, which means that the pointers of what you're updating gets messed up and it basically explodes. Fun times. But eventually I smoothed out all those issues thanks to those quick feedback loops that my test gave me. And I got to a point where I was feeling confident again that I could actually release my app. So before I could release it, I needed to add analytics so I could capture what people were doing in it and measure how they were using the, if they were using the app as I wanted it. So I use Posthog for this, as it provides really solid qualitative analytics tools as well as in-app feedback tooling. And then I released the app so that I could actually do the thing I wanted to do with it, right? Which is to start getting feedback from people on my idea. So once the app was in the App Store, I started becoming that guy and asking everybody I bumped into about reflective journaling and sharing the app in order to collect the feedback on the idea. When you're doing that kind of, that guyness, it's basically important to ask non-leading open questions. So your analytics are going to give you the insight into how users are using your app and which features they're using. But use those feedback sessions that you're doing to get the user to provide you with their views on how the feature fits into the task they're trying to complete and understand their needs. So that's my filing system for all my feedback. It does leave a lot to be desired, but I did have some quick wins. The first one was adding pre-made question sets so that when the person is, or when the user is basically starting to think about the questions they want to ask themselves, they can kind of use pre-made ones and start that quickly. Also being able to manually set the date of the reflection, because that was something that I had also bumped into, trying to retrofit stuff. But there were also some longer term ideas. So being able to add a progression framework, that's what that says. And highlight the journal entries that demonstrate working at the next level on that framework. But also being able to get AI to generate follow-up questions and on fly, based on the content in the reflection, kind of like in a conversational kind of way. And those longer term ideas showed me that people understood the system that I was building, right? It was excellent because, they got it. And that's something that never happened with Jiffy CV. But I think, I had to then think about the next release. Would those ideas show off the full system I was trying to build, or were they already enhancements to things that were already visible? So I decided with 1.1, I was going to add that grow part of the system to the app, allowing the users to create action items during reflection so they could be completed in subsequent reflections. And this would allow me to then understand if people were more interested in reflecting or working towards goals. So going to that career coaching bit. Something that would then help me basically determine what I was going to put my efforts in for 1.2. So with that, 1.1 was looking quite a nice little thing to do. And let's see how that went. So having found my development approach for my MVP, I was feeling confident that 1.1 was going to be a shorter turnaround time. There was less to build, and I had a process that meant I could catch issues popping up quickly. So I did initial spike of the data model changes, and it all went well. I added the action model, I added the relation between the action and the question it was raised against, and I added a means to query all the actions on the growth tab, which is kind of what this is trying to show. I then wrote out my test cases so I could define the behavior, making sure it was clear on which action items would show and how completing the action items would work. And then I combined the two of them to basically write unit tests to ensure that the data was read and updated correctly. But it turns out Swift Data had yet another surprise for me. So in this video, you can see how adding a new action works. And then the resulting action is supposed to end up in the list. But when you go to edit the thing, that's disappeared now. It's on the lat list, but it's not on that list. And when you go and add a new reflection, it's there. It's like, what's going on? The unit test I had written said that this was working as expected. So there was something weird about the kind of testing bit and the app bit. I basically spent loads of time trying to find new approaches to getting this to work. I was mucking around with observable lifecycle methods. I was changing from a relational field to a separate model, but nothing worked. And I was kind of done with Swift Data at that point. I craved the control that you get with something like a relational database like SQL, because you can make sure things work on different levels. And I started looking at alternatives like GRDB and core data, but there's no documentation on how to migrate from Swift Data to those. There are plenty of articles on how to migrate to Swift Data from those, though. And I really didn't want to spend my time re-architecting everything anyways. My interest in the app was to get feedback on my idea and not waste weeks getting back to my MVP's functionality, but with a different approach to managing data. So I was really frustrated. I thought I'd managed to overcome my technical issues. I thought I was hitting my stride, but then I went back to struggling again, and it just really took the wind out of my sails. The impact that it had on me was that I hated looking at Xcode. It stopped being a fun challenge and started becoming repetitive torture, trying to get something to work and it just not happening. The fact that the time spent was spent trying to solve the technical problems and not furthering my means of collecting feedback on my idea really got to me. So I decided to take some time off. I took a month to get out of that, like my head out of that space and focus on other hobbies like music. And that month ultimately turned into 2 months, but eventually I did sit down on my computer and try again. And I made a little bit of progress, and then I just gave up. Admitting defeat is not a fun thing to do, but sometimes you just got to realize that you've made a bad decision and move on. So after a month or so of moping around, feeling like I'm the worst developer in the world, I sat down and reflected on what went wrong. I realized that while my MVP had aligned with my initial goals, the fun part of it for me was trying to learn iOS development. It was fun to learn something new, but was learning a new technology really aligned with my goal of building a product? Not really. Instead of doing the hard work of learning how to build up my product feedback mechanisms and engaging my users, I instead focused on the shiny toy, lying to myself that a new tech stack was an important investment when really the mental overhead of learning something new slowed me down massively. And I'm now regrouping, I'm trying to focus on how to build those product mechanisms and not dive too deep into the tech until it's needed. So my final thought, if anybody's old enough to remember Jerry Springer, when building a product, it's really important to put learning about your user at the forefront of what you do. The technology you choose may provide some fun paradigms to aid that development of that product, but you shouldn't get too invested in it. You need to remain objective of the choices that you have made and have a backup plan if they don't work out, so you can pivot away from that quickly. And it becomes harder to do that when, like me, you try to wear multiple hats, because unless you're great at balancing things, you may end up playing to your strengths and getting distracted. So it might actually be easier instead to find someone who can wear that hat that's the most distracting thing, so you can focus on building your strength in other areas. But while I talk about objectiveness, I think it's also important to point out that subjectiveness can help as well. So I had a lot of energy to sink into my app because I was solving my own problem. I was engaged and I was more willing to spend the time on it because I believed in that end goal. Writing test cases was also easier because I knew what I wanted and I knew what would annoy me as a user, so I could force myself to really think about how I wanted to recover from errors and weird states. But engagement is a double-edged sword. You might have more willing to do stuff, but you're also going to be too invested in the outcomes and it will hit harder if it fails. But I'll leave you with one final thought. Take care of yourself and each other.